All right, welcome to the afternoon session on the payer's perspective on regenerative medicines and advanced therapies. Welcome. I have a amazing panel here. We just were chatting before, and just be prepared that they are going to throw a wrench into everything you think about. So that's kind of our goal. But also our goal also is that the people here, you guys walk away with some nuggets that are practical for using in your businesses, and that's kind of our goal. All right. So before I introduce everybody, I'll just start with a few comments. Right. So prices have been kind of in the press a lot in the U.S. As of late, hasn't they? We've had a company do some pretty extraordinary things with a product pretty much overnight, and then walk it back, and that action caused some pretty violent political discussions, right, which led to a fall in a lot of your stock prices if you're on the market, right, and it led to a wiping out of a lot of value that could have been used for investments in the development of these therapies. Gives you an idea of how our behavior in this field has knock-on effects on all the other companies in the field. So we have a lot of very interesting things to talk about here. So when we think about our therapies, right, we're thinking about I think there's 5 very different things about the therapies that we're talking about. And I think first we're all targeting some pretty big unmet needs. Sometimes a small population, sometimes a big population, but we're going for unmet needs. We're also in many of our cases looking for something that's definitive therapy, or we're striving for something that would be close to a cure. Then also many of our therapies will be one-time treatments, which is pretty different. There's also the personalized manufacturing aspects of our therapies. And then also, for the gene therapies, we're going to have to track how our patients are doing for 15 years. And we're going to have these very long-term follow-up of patients all around the world, which is also pretty new. So these are fairly different things that we have to face. And I think what we want to discuss is about the opportunities and challenges in funding pathways, right? Evaluation pathways for our therapies, and also what are the reimbursement pathways. So how will we get these therapies reimbursed? Okay? So our panel, we talked about this. So let me introduce everybody, and when I call out your name, raise your hand, because it changed the order on me when they gave the microphone. So Michael White. So Michael White is the Director of Clinical Pharmacy Services at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee. He's a member of the plan's corporate P&T committee. He has a medical technology assessment committee and the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association's medical policy panel. His primary responsibilities include formulary management, utilization management, specialty pharmacy, network management, and departmental policies and procedures. We also have Tim Fullmer. He comes from Germany, and he's a founder and managing partner at SmartStep Consulting in Hamburg, Germany. He's a member of the Outcome Research Group University Hospital in Eppendorf, Hamburg. He's the former managing director of Wyeth Pharma, Germany. His key interest is how to best integrate reimbursement requirements into the clinical trial design. And when he sent his description, he said he likes to quote Shakespeare by saying, "Be prepared." Shlomo Melmed, Dr. Shlomo Melmed, he's a senior VP and Dean of Cedars-Sinai Health Systems in Los Angeles. He's active NIH-funded investigator in translational pituitary medicine. He's editor of major global endocrinology textbooks, and he's a CERM board member. Don Balfour. Can you see Don? Don's over here next to me. So Don Balfour, he was the president and medical director of Sharp Rees-Stealy Medical Group from 1985 until the end of 2014. The medical group is part of Sharp Healthcare, an integrated delivery network with 3 commercial ACOs and over 30 years of experience in managed care. Dr. Balfour is a past president of the American Medical Group Association and a past governor and master of the American College of Physicians. Howard Fullman, Dr. Howard Fullman. Dr. Howard Fullman is a board-certified gastroenterologist and internist and in the area of medical and is the area medical director of Kaiser Permanente of West Los Angeles. In this capacity, he is responsible for medical center operations for 225,000 Kaiser Permanente members, 400 physicians, 4,000 employees, Kaiser Foundation Hospital, West Los Angeles, and 5 office buildings. John Fox, Dr. John Fox. John Fox is a pediatrician, epidemiologist, and populationist at Priority Health, the health plan partner in the Regional Integrated Delivery System, Spectrum Health in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His focus is on new technology assessment payment and practice transformation and the role of shared accountability for costs and outcomes on delivery of health and care services. So let's start getting into this, guys. So I'll lob you a softball question first, all right? And then so what do you think, guys? What do you think, and whoever wants to jump first, what do you guys think are the big challenges in terms of getting our kinds of therapies paid for from your point of view? Let's start at the end.
Sure. I would say the biggest challenge from a payer perspective, transient membership. You mentioned earlier following these people for 15 years, and the other thing is, how do we pay for this all up front? Are we going to be able to set it up in some sort of annuity style and amortize the payments out or not? I don't know. These are things that we're starting to discuss, and I'm thankful that I got the opportunity to come here today and hopefully gain some knowledge from you, and perhaps you'll take something away from me.
Great tip.
Yeah, I think taking the perspective of the HTA bodies in Europe, I would say finding the right patients for these therapies, because I think the clinical trials are always for a very limited number of patients, 10, 20, 25 or so, and the target population is always named in these presentations, 25,000, 30,000. So how do you define those patients which you actually also have studied in your trial? Name those patients exactly, and I think you also find reimbursement.
Excellent.
I want to extend something which you just said. I think it's not only identifying the patients, but it's identifying the science. We've got a lot to do on the science still, and the science still has to prove itself. And so I think you're absolutely right in terms of the patients, because we talk about these enormous disease numbers, and so few patients can benefit even from phase 3 trials, or the few that are scientifically valid. And I'll give you an example at our institution. We decided about beginning of the year, about 9 months ago, to open a regenerative medicine clinic. And we opened up the clinic with the goal of allowing access to anybody who has a disease which fitted any of the 6 or 8 or 9 approved trials that we had. And we were stunned that we had hundreds, literally hundreds of patients calling, trying to make an appointment. We thought we'd get 10, 20, 30. So there's a terrific demand out there. There's an unbelievable set of patients with incurable disease or terminal illness which requires regenerative medicine. And it's going to take us a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources to try and navigate this clinical mass of patients without appropriate reimbursement. And absent an enormous philanthropic support, I don't see how we as a society or as medical groups are going to be able to do this. But I'll come back to my first point. We first need more science.
Yeah, mine is similar. I would say there's a difference between something has a scientific benefit versus it has a relevant clinical benefit. And I think defining what those clinical endpoints are to really make sure that anything we invest in has tangible, absolute benefit for people is a first point. The second is figuring out how then to adapt that science to the massive populations that are affected, not just because it'll be expensive, but rather because we can't do everything for everybody all at once, and we have to make sure we're taking care of a population of people with the best overall outcome for the population at large.
If there's one thing that medical directors and health plans and actuaries and people don't like is uncertainty. Uncertainty in who's appropriate to be treated, what the outcomes are, measurable outcomes, what the duration of those outcomes, whether or not retreatment is needed. Defining all of those things will reduce uncertainty. But probably my big take home, and Arturo said he wanted short things, was Don't put me at full risk of treatment failures. We know that these therapies will not be successful. Well, we hope they're curative in all patients, but if I'm at full risk when a treatment fails, and that treatment cost me $1, $2, $3 million, that makes me put up walls. So reduce my uncertainty and don't put me at full risk of failure.
Even though the failure may be as expensive as doing a failed transplant or a mechanical device.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with Dr. Fox that there's a great deal of uncertainty here, and I agree that patient selection is going to be one of the biggest challenges that we're all going to face. And I think that, and I know we're going to talk about it later this afternoon, there have to be some guarantees in this endeavor, because we can't afford to do a treatment for a single patient unless we have some guaranteed outcomes. Because for us, value is outcomes divided by cost. And we don't know what the cost is, and we have to guarantee the outcome, the clinical outcome.
Yeah. Let me just follow up on that. As an epidemiologist, I think about the number needed to treat. How many people do I need to treat with a therapy in order to get one additional person to benefit? If we could get that down to one, I only need to treat one person to benefit from this therapy, that would be ideal. Who would argue with that? And if you can reduce the uncertainty associated with getting down to one, or reduce the cost of failure, or eliminate the cost of failure, then we're swimming in the same direction.
So very closely related to that, because we're talking about uncertainty, we're talking about the patient selection. Let me ask you a kind of provocative question, because this has also been happening a lot. What do you feel? How do you feel about companies who are very early in their development starting to talk about price? I'll ask Tim. I'll ask that with Tim.
Well, I think that is a speculation which might be good to attract investors, but payers nowadays also read balance statements, and of course, payers come to meetings with public transportation. If you go to pharma meetings, you understand a lot of the mooring that pharmaceutical industry doesn't earn as much money anymore, but if you look at the cars, you still find company cars policy quite generous. So I think that speculating too early about price is only raising resistance against your drug and your proposal. I think the best way actually to progress on that is searching early dialogue on questions like, what is the appropriate patient population, what are the appropriate outcomes, how to prove actually a benefit not on biomarkers or not on surrogate parameters but on outcomes. And I think that you will see that there were about uncertainty, that quote here already, that payers just want to see the results in terms of the patient benefit first. So there's no investment in uncertainty, so there's no risk sharing, or this morning there was a lot talk about new payment models. There will be no new payment models in that terms that payers share the risk of development.
I just wanted to caution ourselves that when we talk about cost, especially in regenerative medicine today, as things stand right now, it's not just the drug cost. The regulatory cost is enormous. The unreimbursed regulatory cost to the institution is gargantuan. And that also has to be addressed in the same breath that we address drug cost. So drug cost is only one component. And I'm not an economist, and I can't balance one versus the other. But the regulatory cost is substantial, and I don't see that being reimbursed.
I want to follow this line, but I just want to add a little color to it. So we've heard, and this arm believes, and I think it's right, that we should have very early engagements with payers and reimbursement bodies, and that's a good idea, right? But what should that early engagement look like then?
I think the cat will be out of the bag when the first gene therapy gets approved, and it may be next year with Spark Therapeutics retinitis pigmentosa therapy. So I think that the cost will be shocked and outraged, and then we'll get over it. And then, but I think it's okay to talk about cost, but remember my worry, my uncertainty concern. If you can start to put parameters around what you'll be accountable for and what I'll be accountable for, that will help. And it's not only appropriate patient selection, it's which institutions are going to perform this. I don't believe that this is going to be performed at every community hospital, but how are you going to vet the facilities that are doing this? How can you reduce the probability of a poor outcome and increase the probability of a good outcome? I think you can talk about cost, but you have to talk about it in those contexts.
Yeah, I would add, first of all, the work you're doing is incredible. There's so much potential. Everybody in clinical medicine is waiting for these different therapies to come out. They're extremely exciting. You're developing these wonderful products, which is extraordinarily expensive, to develop at a time where, from a clinical delivery standpoint, the system is being asked to try to deliver more with less. And the system is more now about value and less about reimbursement and demonstrating value. So I think that's the kind of conversation to have with the payers, is say, we'd like to work with you to define the population, figure out if we have an agent that will have a clinical impact for a number of people, and help decide on what pricing strategy we can still have a fair return, but at the same time we have a chance of getting it out to the population that really would benefit from it. I think that's the kind of conversation that would be worth having early.
Tom?
I think the only thing I would add to this pricing discussion is many of the drugs now, from a payer perspective, it looks like they're being priced at what the market will bear. And that's very frightening to us, because that level seems to go up. It was 60,000, then 100,000, and there's some drugs now that 400,000, 600,000 a year to treat a patient. So I think all of you, and maybe collectively, we're all going to think about this. If we take someone with a chronic disease, they're going to extrapolate the costs of treating that patient over maybe not a lifetime, but over a decade or more. And that's going to somehow be reflected in the price. So I'm not sure how we're going to come up with a price that society can manage.
To Don's comment there, the term unsustainable, I can't tell you how many times I hear that throughout the week, especially from our actuaries. But we have to remind them that the disease that are being cured have been unobtainable. So you've got unsustainable versus unattainable. We've got to find the bridge. Where can we put these two together?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, go ahead.
I would just add that the access that people have to these therapies is inversely related to the price. The higher it is, the more dubious the payers are going to be about the benefit. And if you just think about it, even just from a profit and loss point of view and return on the research investment, it's not necessarily the case that the highest price is going to lead to the best long-term, the best return. So even just from an economic standpoint, I'm not convinced that for many of these therapies, having the highest price is going to be the best thing for your companies, and that's where I think the conversations with the payers would be very important.
Yeah. To follow up on Don's comment, we hope that these therapies could be curative. If we had a cure for cystic fibrosis, I'm paying somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000 for people who have specific mutations for cystic fibrosis. But be careful, because oftentimes what pharmaceutical manufacturers will say, well, we're going to save all these costs downstream, and therefore we can justify our price. Well, if you take all the savings away from me and leave nothing for me and the employers that I insure, it sets us up into an oppositional position. You'd much rather have me playing offense on your side and promoting your therapy than playing defense and trying to prevent people from getting your therapy. So remember that there is terrific promise for reducing long-term healthcare costs, but don't take it all, because it won't leave us in a position where we're operating on the same side, or playing on the same side.
Tim?
Yeah, I think also for you as companies, you have to be careful about what you promise and what data you actually have to promote this. I mean, the case of Libera in Europe and in Germany, if you want to really understand that, there need to translate the evaluation of the assessment body in Germany, what they think about the therapy, and it puts a lot of stress onto the company, because if you promise one time injection injection will cure a disease or will significantly lower, in that case, this specific form of hyperlipidemia, then you have to also provide long-term data. But if you only come up with 2.3 years of follow-up data, you cannot even claim that you are 5 years effective. So if you want to have long-term data, you also have to run registries, run longer-term trials. So be careful about what you promise, because otherwise you will be took by your promises.
And yet the FDA has shown that it requires very little evidence to approve some therapies. So Keytruda, which is an immunotherapy, pembrolizumab, was approved for non-small cell and lung cancer last Friday, based on phase 2 trial data with, I don't know, I don't even think there were 100 patients in the trial. And so oftentimes we get stuck because the FDA has approved something, and now we have to make a decision based on very limited evidence about how we're going to cover this. And that, again, puts us in a position of being defensive because we don't know what the long-term outcomes or even the short-term outcomes. We have some preliminary data, but not the type of data that would allow us to make a clear decision based on the evidence.
I think that's an important nugget for us to think about, right? That for most of us, we will have interesting, very, very solid short-term data that we'll want to extrapolate to long-term value, right? But we'll have to have the discussion with you guys, right, to say, to try to prove that to you. So let's flesh that out a little bit more. Let's flesh that out, because I know that's come up in a few places that I've been in. Let's talk a little bit about that. What kind of things would you need to see? What kind of a conversation would we need to have?
I think an important component, especially for rare diseases, are the societies, the patient societies and physician societies. So for example, the ALS Association. An ALS Association, as you know, deals with a terrible disease with very, very little hope for thousands of people, but it's a rare disease. But marshalling that group of passionate individuals behind you in your efforts to convince the FDA and to convince the payers is very important. And the politicians hear that. And the ALS Association, for example, has now had this wonderful initiative for the Ice Bucket Challenge. And they've raised millions of dollars in the space of 2 years for very, very profound research. So, for example, we've benefited from that in that we're now going to be banking 1,000 IPS lines from 1,000 ALS patients to create their own IPS lines, which will be a wonderful resource. But it's supported by philanthropy, it's supported by the passion of the community. And I shudder to think how much that's going to cost a payer. If every ALS patient or every patient with a rare disease demands of their physician or of their group or of their employer that they pay for creating an IPS line. But that's the kind of community involvement I think that has to be added to the equation.
I agree with that totally. I'd also add that partnering with the various physician experts in these fields is extremely important. And the obvious would be the people who have the best reputations academically in the field, but I would also extend that to the societies of the various physicians in the field. And then large organizations like ours, we have 6,000 physicians, national experts in almost everything. We're going to want to do our own evaluation and see the data. And we would appreciate being brought in early about what the trials are, what they're going to look like, and even participate in some of the trials. So I think partnering with clinical gurus of different types, both in academia and otherwise, will be an important part of the work, because it's not clear necessarily up front what data one would need to pass muster with the people who are going to have to make these difficult decisions.
But therein lies the rub. The regulatory environment today for expert thought leader consultation to drug companies is very gray right now, as you know. And we're in a situation right now where many companies, especially smaller companies, who are trying to get the best thought leaders on their side, at least for honest and high-level consultation, are stymied because of regulation. I think that also has to be addressed.
You know, I think the reality is that every company in this room wants to get a product to market. You've got investors, whether it be your own money or investor dollars, that you need to generate a return on as quickly as possible. So this is true for everybody. While there are significant regulatory hurdles, companies want to do the minimal amount they can to get a drug to market. And especially for these therapies that we hope are single therapies, we won't know that that's the case because you've got 2 years of data, 2.3 years of data. And so I've got this anxiety that, gosh, what happens if this patient is a Medicare, a Medicaid patient who's going to be on my plan for the next 5 years? What happens when that treatment fails? Am I on the hook again for another one? So think about what you're going to do to mitigate my risk, to reduce my uncertainty if, in fact, your therapy doesn't last as long as you'd hoped it would. What's your skin in the game? And I think that's probably a term that we haven't talked about is accountability. What's your accountability for cost and outcomes? And Don's organization is expert at that, about physicians accepting accountability for costs and outcomes. But why do we limit that to physician groups and hospitals? Why don't we look at across the board and say, what's going to be your accountability for cost, and what's going to be your accountability for outcomes? And if you can come to me and say, we only have 2.3 years worth of data, we think this is going to be a lifelong therapy or a single treatment, we're not certain, but if this patient needs retreatment, this is what it will cost. And not only if I paid for the first time, but let's say that I inherit this patient from Don's plan, what happens to my cost there? Am I paying full freight again? So think about what you're going to do to reduce my uncertainty and my anxiety with the short-term data that you have.
Arturo, I'm wondering where the audience is with this, because if there are multiple small companies out there, I know you represent a large company, but I'm not sure how they're not going to be able to run 15-year studies, and we can't all wait that long anyway.
Right.
So there's going to be a lot of extrapolation, if you will, and maybe we'll get a 2 or 3 year study. But I see this as there's going to have to be a huge amount of consolidation here, and there's certainly been a lot of merger and acquisitions within the pharmaceutical industry recently. So I think as soon as someone has a promising product, I think that one of the larger companies is going to try to acquire them.
To Don's point, typically when Pharma comes around and they've got a new product coming out and they want to come visit us, I put them off as far as I can,
So when a small company comes in, or when a big company comes in?
Even the big ones.
All right, just saying.
It depends on the compound that we're talking about.
Sure.
And what kind of magnitude it is, and sometimes we don't meet with them at all, and sometimes we'll bring them in 12 weeks before we think it's going to be approved. This is a different story altogether. I've got actuaries that make 3-year plans, and some of these therapies that are out there are significantly going to impact us. So we're hungry for the information, but we have to have information that's backed up with evidence.
So it sounds to me like a key takeaway here is the key early dialogues that we need to have with payers is to develop the kinds of trials in the patient populations where when we get the results from that, your risks are mitigated, and we understand what we're getting into, right? So that's the kind of discussion we should have with the payers.
But you can never eliminate risk. Medicine is not engineering.
Right.
There's always going to be risk, and so not as a non-payer, as a user, as a beneficiary of the payers, we're cognizant hour by hour, day by day, that medicine is very, very risky, and whatever treatments we have is high risk. And so I don't think we should aim for absolute risk-free products. They're not going to be there.
Right.
I just want to add that, of course, cost is on everybody's mind. Most of the questions I think about cost. The society is assessing the cost of healthcare every day. It's gotten to be more and more of a national issue. But just for the moment, I'd like to start with that most of us are clinicians, and we're very excited by the possibility of actually curing some very bad diseases and treating successfully some chronic diseases. I'd like to turn it a little bit and say that cost could be a tool to actually get these therapies out in a way that they can be maximally beneficial. So we're coming from the point of view that they're going to automatically be unaffordable, and that's where people are coming from. I'd like to make the pitch, what about thinking about how to make them more affordable, and thinking therefore how to generate the data that everybody believes in, that for certain subsets of people they really work. It might take 2 years, it might take 10. It depends on the end value, the clinical entity, and all the rest, what a good study is. But let's also think about how to do the most good for the maximum number of people, not only focus on how to maximize profitability.
Interesting. Any more we want to add to that one?
Yeah, I would like to add, because the question is what is the data you have to present. I think I'm German, so Germany is black or white, and this part is it's written in the law. So it's mortality, morbidity, patient-relevant morbidity, for instance, no clinical parameters, hyperemia level, triglyceride level, but whether you can walk or not, 6-minute walk test, for instance. It's quality of life, and if a new treatment has worse quality of life, what is it all about, as the new gene therapy actually had? And the last one is side effects. So it's written in the law, and as Germans are, they just stick to the law. So it's
Like Volkswagen? I'm sorry.
Oh, touche. I think it's footnoted.
we can also speak about the car industry, because I think there's a huge learning in the car industry, actually. Not about Volkswagen. I'm not driving Volkswagen, although they are all nice cars. But
He's also a spokesperson for Germany.
Yeah, I am. Of course, I'm German. And but the company who provided some of the software it was built in by Volkswagen, but a company actually provided some of the software is Bosch. And Bosch is one of those electronic companies. And I think one of the learnings is why they actually reinvented a lot of things, and they are progressing so fast on the electronics in the car industry, is because they gave away patents after 2 years. So the engineers actually had to reinvest and re-engineer things. And so one of the questions actually is about what do we do with all those patents? And I think that's for the cell-based industry particularly important, because another example is this eye therapy, Holoclar, which is also a brand new therapy, but it was actually done in German hospitals before at let's say marginal cost. Now a company actually produces it, has a central laboratory, and sells it back to the 20-fold price. So how do you deal with those, industrialization of techniques, and how much value does that produce, and whether that is patentable or not? So that's also a view of the payers.
So let me ask a slightly different question now. Still on the whole price point aspect, right? So we have this company that overnight raises in the U.S. raises the prices of something 5,000%. I didn't calculate the numbers because I had a small calculator, and the violent political reaction, stocks prices go down because of this violent political reaction. Now it's like this topic is like a political hot potato now, right? Does that make your lives easier or harder? How does it affect what you have to do? How does it affect your job? Don?
Well, I was just embarrassed. I mean, that this could even occur. But as far as there's obviously been no immediate effect other than, as you mentioned, the biotech companies have taken a pretty big hit from this. But it obviously hasn't affected us immediately. And I know they reduced their price increase. I'm not sure how much they reduced it, but I think it's just inexcusable.
Yeah. I think for the most part it helps us because it shines a light on the prices of therapies that we all ultimately pay for as taxpayers or employers, or it comes out of our paychecks. So I think it helps. ASCO and NCCN in the cancer space are developing value metrics or value tools to help weigh the costs and benefits. But I think ultimately the question is whether Congress will give Medicare statutory authority to bargain for drug prices. They've given the VA that statutory authority, and the VA gets the best prices anywhere. But how much the government will have in a role in gene therapy, since this is, I think, going to be indicated primarily for a younger population, it's not clear. But I think all this discussion about pricing and the transparency that it's brought, I think leads more and more to some type of regulation around the total cost.
Yeah.
Did you have something?
No, go ahead. I was going to ask what you think.
Well, first, I think it was Justice Louis Brandeis who said that sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. And I think there's been a progressive amount of cynicism and skepticism about pricing for pharmaceuticals and devices, et cetera. And in the medical community, it's a concern to us because it does affect our ability to be able to bring these important therapies to the population at large. A great example of that is hepatitis C therapy. I happen to be a gastroenterologist. I follow it very closely. People wonder how a pill can cost $1,000. They just wonder about that, especially when the pill manufactured in the United States costs less in Europe. And so it makes people wonder about whether or not we have a fair market going on with the cost of these products. And I think that rising cynicism is unhealthy for your industry. And I think the transparency that you're hearing us advocate would be a better thing for your industry because it would make us believe more in the products, not just as ways of generating profitability, but for also trying to do good for people. Now, I'm a capitalist, and I work in the capitalistic system, and I believe that there ought to be a very, very fair return, and especially when there's a lot of risk. But the risk cannot be used to justify an exorbitant price making healthcare unaffordable. And I think this particular example made people think that that is indeed the problem we have going on in the country.
Yeah.
I think, well, I totally agree with you, but I think you're even understating it. I think, unfortunately, regrettably, patients have taken this very hard, and it's sort of confounded their skepticism and their anger against drug companies in general. Maybe unjustified, but it's out there, and this has just given further ammunition and further fuel on the fire of that public anger. And so it's regrettable and morally reprehensible to the patients that we talk to.
Let's throw another log in that fire.
Yeah, well, as a consultant, I think it was good because problems are good for consultants, and therefore I think the industry has more problems now. In terms of, did it happen in the past? Does it happen in the future? Yes, it will. It did happen in the past. As we spoke in the preparations, I've said, every reform law in Germany, drug market gets regulated every 2 years in a different way. Every law has a company name to it. And so because it's a response against, what people believe as unsocial behavior from drug companies, and so that drug law, always have a company name to it. I think what the industry has to clear is how to deal, internally, Deutsche Bank, I don't know whether you know that picture where the Deutsche Bank CEO went away after his private little dispute in the court. So that destroyed his public image forever. I think Volkswagen's image will be heavily, you can invest a lot in PR, but if you do one case, just remember payers, they basically sit for 20 years in their positions, not sitting in that sense, I'm sorry for that, but they remain in their paying functions within the organization.
They remember.
They are not like in the industry where you have a new job every 2 years. So you meet them 10 years after and they still tell you why did GSK, when all the production of the vaccines fell out, why did GSK in that moment raise the prices of pediatric vaccines? So they can, you don't even know that, but it's so stick to their mind. So I think, just having that ethical behavior, I think is so important for the industry. I just don't see it happening immediately.
Yeah, it's interesting. Gilead, who makes these hepatitis C drugs, had, at least in our organization and in Michigan where we make cars too, it had a stellar reputation. It had developed a number of HIV drugs that were very highly desired, very effective, and overnight the reputation evaporated, at least in the managed care space, in the payer space, because they didn't do a good job of educating us about why they could justify this price. It was all after the fact, after the pricing was announced. And to your point, Arturo, that talking about how much this has cost and why it's going to cost that much would be helpful up front, so you don't get lambasted when you first come out. In fact, it would probably be good not to be the first one out with the gene therapy. So let the first guy out take the hit.
Let me give him a chance to answer
Sure.
this.
To Tim's point, I actually think it was good. I mean, sovaldi was good. People now recognize within my own company what I'm having to deal with. I've been there for 15 years, and most of them didn't know who I was until this $1,000 tablet came about. So I'm on their radar now, and I keep to meet with the actuaries twice a month. Gene therapy I've got it on their radar, and so those folks are starting to watch. So it's the dark cloud with the silver lining.
Tom, let me just make one comment. And then
Sure.
So I think this is another important nugget that we should consider, is the different time horizons between industry people who are working in the field and the payer. They're typically on a professional, very different time horizon, and the payer has very long memory on that aspect. And it's an important factor. It's an important factor. So, Don.
Yeah, I was in my position for 38 years, and we do have long memories. But I want to go back to the gene pricing again. Generally, with the oral products that we have, the new products, not the established ones, where we see the price increases, every other month almost, even on generic drugs. But if you look at the pricing of gene therapy, the way it's been done with oral drugs in the past is they would, I assume, calculate their cost of developing the drug through the clinical trials, and then they would also price in the failure. So if you have one drug that goes to market and 9 that fail, that's all priced into that drug that goes to market. So the question that I have is, are you going to be able to determine what your cost of developing these therapies is going to be? I mean, you can, I assume, calculate it quarter to quarter and year to year, and you'll get an amount that it costs you to develop it. You won't have the benefit, I don't think, of pricing in the failures, because I'm assuming you're not going to have any failures. You're going to have probably 1 or 2 products with each of the companies, unless it's a very large company. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this develops. But someone mentioned transparency. I mean, that's what we're asking for. We don't understand why a tablet costs $1,000. I will bet you anything it didn't cost $1,000 to develop that. And so I think it goes back to my statement where they priced it at what the market will bear. And then they found out that maybe the Senate and other people didn't like that price. And we all know that they've discounted it to many different payers. So.
Yeah, one of the things I think that those of us in the delivery systems realize is that we don't really have a true free market, in the sense that the person receiving the service and the person paying is not the same. The patents, the direct-to-market advertising, and all of that have influences on pricing, and that kind of creates what the market will bear. That's our American system. That's how we do it. But I think if those of you in your positions exploit it too much, there's going to be a backlash against that. And the third-party payers are going to recognize, wait a second, Part D, indemnity insurance, all the rest, that in a way they're targets. And in addition, it's having an influence on who gets what therapy. So I think from a societal standpoint, as well as honestly for the sustainability of these various enterprises that you are developing, that thinking about trying to do this in a more fair market way is probably a more sustainable model.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, you have to make your margins without price increases. I remember years ago, I think you might even be here, I was talking to a fellow at an NCCN conference about the first Greek debt crisis, and I said, so how are you getting reimbursed for drugs in Greece now? He said, well, we're not. And in fact, we had to take an unscheduled price increase in the United States to make our margin. And it's typical that we have all these price increases, not because we have more clinical trials, not because the drug is more effective, not because the drug has broader indications, but because you can increase the prices, and it's frustrating. Copaxone, the price of Copaxone to treat multiple sclerosis has gone up 400%. How much has the efficacy improved since it was first released? 0. And so in order to meet shareholder expectations for returns, if you can't sell more drug, what do? You increase the price. So as you think about how you're pricing these, think about how the price is going to remain stable, because I guarantee you that if you start out at $1 million and then 2 years from now it's 1.5 and now it's $3 million 5 years from now because you're not making your margins to satisfy your shareholders, that will give you a black eye as well.
So let me open it up to the audience for some questions before I continue it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up for some questions, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to take the room up again. All right, so this was kind of like, oh, we got pretty beat up, and I want to take the room back up again, all right, after that, okay? So questions. There's a question here.
Hi, very interesting discussion for sure. A lot of the discussion was focused on gene therapy as a cure, but there are so many other applications for regenerative medicine. Can you shed some light on your thoughts about, things that are for acute situations, GVHD, for example, stroke, myocardial infarction, these kinds of things, which there is a high potential for a real good, clinical outcome, but it's not a lifetime type of approach.
Who wants to take that?
I can take a crack at that. Yes, that's a great question. In fact, we currently have trials now going on for exactly those indications in heart disease, for various forms of acute myocardial infarction, acute heart failure, and you're absolutely correct. They're all trials. It's not approved therapy, but the results of the trials led by Eduardo Marban at Cedars-Sinai clearly indicate that patients with acute myocardial infarction who are treated appropriately in a trial setting with a cell therapy do in fact recover myocardial function, and that is a one-time treatment. The time itself may be months, but it's not a sustained years or decades long treatment. So you're absolutely right, and the same approach is now being applied to stroke, and I think that those kinds of diseases should be put into a separate category from the true degenerative brain and musculoskeletal disorders, which require a different kind of approach, which is really going to be sustained and long-term, like Parkinson's and ALS and perhaps even osteoarthritis and osteoporosis. But for the acute events, you're absolutely right, and I think that there will be a different kind of a challenge to the payers for those kinds of patients who will have a finite treatment period with a cell-based regenerative therapy.
Sure.
Yeah, and I didn't realize the room was down, but I know cost and pricing does tend to get people down.
Yeah.
But I think I've said 2 or 3 times how excited I am as a clinician and how excited we are as an organization for the potential of these therapies. And it's not just genetic therapies, it's treatment of acute illnesses and chronic illnesses. The way I think of it as enormous potential, these therapies will be compared to the existing therapies and therapies that are not based upon regenerative medicine. And in the cases where the therapies based on regenerative medicine are as good as or better clinically than what exists currently or otherwise what's being developed, I think they're going to be utilized quite a bit. I'm very excited about it. I think the work you're doing has enormous potential for patients, for people in this country and around the world. And even though we've been talking a lot about cost today, I think what you're doing has a tremendous amount of potential and excitement. But it will have to be assessed vis-a-vis the existing and other kinds of therapies for these conditions.
Yeah, absolutely.
You jumped the gun, Howard. I wanted to hold the audience in a little bit of a nervous state for a little longer and then bring them back up.
But I want to just interject with, I think Michael raised the point which I think is very valid, which we are sensitive to. That even if a therapy is short-lived, and just for example, acute myocardial regenerative therapy can be successful and prevent a heart transplant 10 years down the line. But your argument is valid, and that doesn't help you, because within 10 years, your patient may have changed insurance companies 3 times. So how do you deal with that, and how do we deal with that reality? And we're very, very sensitive to that reality. I think the average time now is 2.2 years, right, for the average American to stay in a single plan. Is that correct?
Yeah, plus you have to show the data that not potentially a drug can save a transplant, but you actually do save a transplant.
But it won't help him. Even if it does save the transplant, it won't help his company or this payer, because the patient won't be with that payer in 10 years.
Well, that's an insufficiency of the system here, but in
in Germany.
Well, I think for most European, kind of socialized systems,
single payer. Yeah.
With the uniform payer, even if the payers are not uniform, they would say, if that is, saving transplantations, then of course we would have to pay for it. But the question is what level we have to pay for it. So it's not like, those socialized payers don't want new therapies. That is the totally wrong tone. They actually do all want the new therapies, but not at this extraordinary price. So, and I think that the difficulty lies within the clinical studies. How do you design the clinical studies that you actually show reduction in mortality, improved morbidity, improved quality of life, reduced side effects? So I think that is the key term, and there's another difficulty coming up. So if you compare to like standard therapy, you have to define standard therapy. So what is the best physiotherapy, what is the best rehabilitation post-stroke, and so on. So you actually have an additional burden for your clinical trial program.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring the crowd back down again.
Thanks, Don. Thanks.
When we were talking about pricing, and we've been mentioning sovaldi, which is $1,000 a pill for hopefully a 12-week program, I think there's a lot of speculation, at least among physicians, that price, $98,000 or whatever the price has come down to now, is quite similar to a liver transplant. Because you mentioned, the transplant, and that's the thing. So you're treating a patient now and hopefully curing them and preventing a transplant a decade or more out.
Yeah. I think the challenge with these short-term therapies is twofold. One is the evidentiary standards are going to be higher because we have existing treatments for those, and the second is who knows where we'll be in 5 years. In the UK, they have NICE where they're looking at the cost effectiveness, and you have to come in at a certain threshold. So the delta in the outcome divided by the delta in the price has to come in at 30,000 pounds or a quality of 30,000 pounds or less. Can you produce your therapy at that price point? I think the other challenge is we use a principle we call the consequences of failure principle, and we may have a less effective but less expensive therapy, and if there are no long-term consequences of mandating that less effective, less expensive therapy, we believe we have the right to do that. We do it with all sorts of drugs today with lipid-lowering agents. In this case, if we had a therapy for an acute myocardial infarction and there were no consequences of failing standard therapy and reserving this for failures in standard therapy, we would reserve the right to require that failure of a standard therapy before people got a gene therapy. So identifying the patient population is critical, and defining that there are consequences of not using the best therapy first is also important.
Let me take another question. There's a microphone right here.
I consult on pricing and market access, so it's encouraging hearing some of your comments. It means some of the advice I give is well-founded. And when I look at some of the companies in regenerative medicine, one thing I always find pretty striking is the peak revenues. There was a company earlier, meaning because they're in multi-billion dollars. There was a company earlier that said peak revenue would be 6 billion pounds, which is about 10 billion US dollars, which is roughly the value of Lipitor at its peak. And so in Europe, we know that we can be called in to renegotiate anytime, any day of the week, anytime they wish. In the US, that's less so, and in turn, we often see price increases. But in the past few years, there's been more requests for price protection. And so my question to the US-based colleagues is, how much are your plans utilizing things like price protection, CPI maximums per annum, and things like that in order to manage such high expected sales that you might see with some of these medicines, if you can answer that?
I would say as far as price protection goes, most contracts that we enter into now, that is part of it. Not every contract, certainly. But it's also one that doesn't lessen our risk as great as it could, perhaps. There's still a lot of growth within a year's time that can occur. But then again, this is something that we didn't have in the past. So it's what we're pursuing. And potentially in therapies like this, that's another avenue for us to consider.
It's hard to demand price protection when you've got an FDA-approved therapy and a monopoly producer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, first of all, our organization, we're fortunate at Kaiser Permanente, the average person stays with us for 19 years. So actually, we think that the returns are very good, and we're actually, generally speaking, when something is evidence-based and our doctors believe in it, we adopt it to our entire population to which it would apply. And I think that would apply to gene therapy, things for acute illnesses, chronic therapy, etc. I do think, though, given the phenomenon that people move around a lot in their insurance, I think you're going to see a lot more reinsurance going on. If you look at the Affordable Care Act, one of the ingenious elements of the Affordable Care Act was the concept of risk readjustment across plans and a reinsurance phenomenon with a stop loss. And I think that's probably a trend that's going to go on in this country, as certain things are by definition going to be expensive, because it really isn't right for a payer to pay for something that might cost $1 million and then the next year the person leaves that plan. They're going to be very, very reluctant to do that. But I think that trend of having reinsurance and risk readjustment is one way to mitigate that phenomenon across different insurance plans.
Should I go to another question? Let's go to, where's the microphone? Here, right here.
I have a question on the populations that are at risk. Now, many of the new products that are being developed are for, I would say, fairly rare conditions, such as 3,000, 5,000 patients. But then also there are products that are going to be developed for a larger population, say 5 million or so, where you can reverse certain diseases. How does pricing come into effect, and how do you react to that for reimbursement for a small population versus one that could be quite large? The same kind of curative therapies.
Don?
Well, we touched on that a little bit earlier. If you look at what used to be called the rare disorders, unfortunately now there are about 300 of these rare disorders, and the treatment for each one of them can be anywhere from $100,000 to $300,000 a patient, and sometimes that's on an annual basis. So even rare diseases are a problem. But another example, if you talk about a large population, we all know about this new cholesterol drug that's coming out. It's going to cost $13,000 a year, as opposed to something like a atorvastatin that's generic. So I mean, we become very concerned when you talk about large populations of patients. So if you're talking about 5,000 patients, or for a country like ours, maybe a million or two. That's very concerning to us. So the size of the population that we're talking about is very important. Like when we're talking about the acute illnesses, I mean, the number of acute myocardial infarctions every year must be huge. And so you have to take that into consideration. I don't know. We like to see, for large populations, we like to see lower prices so that we can treat more patients. As Dr. Fullman has said, I mean, we'd like to treat as many patients as we can with the treatment. But if it's priced, out of reach, so to speak, then we have to go back to patient selection and be very careful who we treat.
To put some flavor onto what you said, and I totally agree with you, the number one DRG for admission, for inpatient admission, is congestive heart failure. Still congestive heart failure, the number one admission. With all the drugs and all the surgeries and all the wonderful advances in cardiology, it is the number one DRG.
Yeah.
Well, for Europe, I mean, there are various ways of dealing with it. So there's this explicit rationing, like in the UK, where, for your commissioning body, let's say you have 20 patients, and if you are patient number 21, they say to you, you are patient number 21. Unfortunately, we run out of allowance here, and you are not treated, and then you can go to somebody else, to your MP or so. And in France, it's you negotiate a whole budget for France of, let's say, 100 patients, and after that, the company has to pay 100% discount. So actually number 101 gets treated, but for free for the government. So in Germany, it's less explicit in that sense. You go to your physician, the physician is kind of half socialized in that system too. So although he knows that you might benefit, he will use all old therapies before he gives you access to the new therapy. So if you ask him privately, he would say, actually probably 2 out of my 10 patients would benefit from it, but I actually give it only 1 out of 50. So because I think it's too expensive. So you have various forms in the systems of dealing with it.
Is the physician incentivized in any way?
Well, he's incentivized. If he overspends, he has to pay from his private pocket. So he wants to avoid. He's not incentivized like in the US, which I think is wrong. He doesn't participate in the pharma sales. Yeah. So it's an opposite system. He gets disincentivized if he does overprescribing.
Yeah. I think the question about orphan diseases versus common diseases goes back to the question of, with any of these therapies, are we increasing the total cost of care or decreasing the total cost of care? Heart failure is the most common reason for admission in the country. If you can bring a therapy to market that reduces the total cost of care, subtract the cost of the drug, and I reduce hospitalizations, then who's not going to buy that? But if the only thing that we pay for is cost-effective therapies that improve outcomes but also increase costs, where do we go? At our plan, we just increase prices. We increase prices to the government, we increase prices to employers, and at some point, who can afford this? The financial toxicity. We've got great cancer therapies, but very few people can receive those therapies without significant financial toxicity. And so whether the financial toxicity is at the individual patient level or at the societal level from the cost of these therapies, that has to be borne in mind. But again, if you can bring something to market that reduces the total cost of care because you're curative and reduce downstream costs for the next 40 years, that's terrific. Who's not going to buy that? But if we just do something that reduces the likelihood of admission for heart failure by 40%, at a cost of $1 million per patient, that's where we're going to be playing defense, trying to prevent access to this therapy.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll go back to the list that I have. All right. So,
hi there. Thanks for this great input and great insight that you're providing. I know we all appreciate it from the industry side. One of the points of feedback for industry that I'm hearing loud and clear, and that I think many of us have tried to follow in our careers as commercial people and trying to price drugs, is to provide a value story for the drug. Build not only the clinical evidence but economic evidence, the burden of disease, the potential cost effectiveness of the drug once it's launched. But I hear also skepticism of industry data. I mean, is there changing willingness, especially in rare diseases or diseases where that might be paradigm changing, where a company might be trying to claim that by paying for this expensive therapy now, even though it's a pill, you're going to save costs later. Can you talk a little bit about what credible data we as industry can provide to you, or is it not even worth us trying to provide those types of economic arguments in our value story for you before launch?
Well, I think cynical rhymes with clinical, and so
that's a nugget. I think that's definitely a nugget.
I'm writing that down.
That just goes with the territory. We have a lot of folks come and they want to present health outcomes to us, and that's great. Bottom line is, those are not our numbers. If they want to share their logic with us and we're intrigued by it enough, we've got 100 people in bioinformatics that can crunch those numbers for us. So coming from industry, we can appreciate the foundation and the logic behind it, but we're not going to buy into it without testing it ourselves.
Well, I've been fortunate in my career. I trained at UC San Francisco during the AIDS epidemic. We opened the first AIDS board when I was a chief resident, and so I think through all the things I've seen in my career when AIDS was a very serious disease with a very high likelihood of death to now people survive with it as a chronic disease and largely do really well. And I think about hepatitis C and the advances. I think the agents are great. And so I actually think about that in general, what I've seen in my career, and I think most American physicians have seen, as a tremendous amount of progress. So we're not, I don't think, disbelievers in the value of new therapies, but we want to see data that is scientifically valid. So it needs to have an appropriate duration, whatever that is, based upon the disease. It has to have enough power. It has to have enough N value. It has to be legitimate. Where something is falling short, nothing has to be perfect, but we have to see where it's imperfect. I'm always gratified when someone presents something to me, whether it's about a pharmaceutical or regenerative medication or a business proposition, when they give me the pros and cons. And they don't try to present something as though it's an absolute panacea, because not that many things are absolute panaceas. And then we're going to make judgments based upon clinical outcomes and duration and alternatives. I personally don't like to make decisions about patients largely on cost, to be honest. And I'm in a position where I happen to lead. We don't really make those decisions per se that way. But we do, as an organization, have to be sensible and thoughtful about how much extra value we're bringing if we're bringing a new therapy in. So what I'm asking for is transparent, honest data, shows the good and the bad, has a proper power to it, and all of the other scientific requirements that we all know from our years of training that will convince us that this is something worth considering.
I'm going to say something unpopular for this audience. And that is, I think that the highest leverage, to answer your question, in my mind, is in areas where the medical profession has failed. And that is simply to stop smoking, drinking, and obesity. And those three things can do trillions of dollars of cost savings, far more than any of the great drugs that you're developing. And we ourselves are at fault as a society and certainly as a medical profession. And just those three things, tobacco and alcohol and obesity, could save our health economy and our health bill trillions of dollars if done properly.
Ooh, can I? Oh, go ahead. I want to be equally unpopular. You know, if
it's a race to the bottom.
Yeah, race to the bottom. When we ultimately, as a society, we want to improve health status for populations of patients. Yes, there are patients with rare diseases, and we can't forget about them. But if we wanted to do things to improve health status, it would be the very things you talked about. But the one thing that would improve health status more than anything else in this country would be to improve education. And we're kind of in this, we used to be in a military arms race where we spent millions of dollars or billions of dollars, trillions of dollars on arms, but couldn't fund education. And I kind of see us entering into, or if we're not already there, into a medical arms race to see how many diseases we can cure or palliate. And yet, if we really asked as a society where there are limited resources, how do we balance on patient autonomy versus justice? We'd have to say that for the benefit of the most people, we would invest in something other than healthcare. And so I agree with you. Are we missing the mark here by investing all these resources for the benefit of few when there are thousands of patients who can't benefit at all?
Don?
I was just going to make a comment to try to answer the question.
You don't want to win the dispopularity test.
No, I don't think we've answered the question. What you're talking about really are medical offsets. And for us, it's usually the high-ticket items like hospitalizations and emergency room visits and things like that. We tend to, as has been expressed, we tend to dispel those or ignore those because it's not our data, number one, and if we actually save that much money with every new drug that comes out, healthcare would be free. So it's, what we do is we just look at it from a budget impact perspective. We look at how much the drug costs and how many patients we have. And as I mentioned earlier, we have 4 patients right now with an allergic diagnosis, and they were spending $400,000 to $500,000 a year per patient. So we're very aware of those. So that's, and whether that saves any outpatient visits or hospitalizations is almost irrelevant. But so we don't put a lot of credence on medical offsets unless you can come up with a cure. If you can come up with a cure, then we can try to factor in, what maybe it's saving a transplant, maybe it's saving hospitalizations, but it's probably not going to come close to covering the cost of the drug or the treatment.
I'm not a big believer in health economic models, but I have to say there are certain European countries where health economic models are mandatory, like in England and Wales, but the NICE does look at health economic model. It's mandatory. In Sweden, it's mandatory. In the Netherlands, it's mandatory. France actually seems to go that way, which is undecided at the moment. There are other countries like Germany, like Southern European countries, Eastern Europe again is another story, but where basically only clinical data count. It's also somewhat independent of budget impact models, or whatever you understand under that, so the clinical data. And I think what is important there in terms of augmenting, so outcomes data, health outcomes data can never replace clinical data. So a lot of companies are asking, well, we don't have the clinical study, can we do something to augment that? That is impossible, if you don't have it in the clinical data. But I think what is important is epidemiology, because a lot of people don't understand really the epidemiology. There's a lack of data on epidemiology. Just give me that example, the time for morbus Fabry. There are some gene therapies out now looking into morbus Fabry, and there have been the enzyme therapies. And so, obviously there's a fraction only of people who have the genetic defect have symptomatic disease. And so what the payers really hate is when you go out for genetic screening and kind of increase your patient population, which is normally asymptomatic. So that is something where you have to be really careful with.
So we have almost exactly 4 minutes left, and I want to end this one in a high. It's like really in a high, because I think we're like in the middle now. So let's go to the high. So I won't be able to ask everybody, but what would you say? All right, so what final comment or message would you like to leave with our associates today to help them understand how the stakeholder you represent might view our organization and offering? So I want you to really drive it home. Or everybody got kind of a little beat up and kind of a little worried here and everything. What can we say to all the people here who are working their butts off to get these therapies to market, to get them motivated to get these therapies out there?
How about go for the cure?
I think we're on the cusp of a phenomenal revolution, and we're all part of it, and people in this room are contributing to it, and that wave should not crest in our lifetimes, and may it just continue.
I think what you are doing and what the potential is that you have to do is just incredibly, just amazing. I see it as an important part of the future in healthcare in the country. I do agree that healthcare has to be everything from prevention to episodic care to chronic care to tertiary care. There's no doubt that people will have an appetite for the therapies that you're developing, and that systems like ours definitely want to see these therapies come forward. But I think it would be best to partner with the people who are in the clinical systems to make sure that you're developing drugs and other therapies that we feel we can really use and that we can understand.
Payers want new therapies. Talk to them early to meet their requirements.
We're very excited. I mean, this is great. This is a very impressive alliance. My closing remark would be collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. And with that, I mean, with the payers, I mean, let us work with you with legislation. Don't work against us and mandate legislation. That just builds fences that we don't need to build. This is fantastic technology. I think Elton John's song was, don't understand all the science, it's just my job 8 days a week. And I don't understand all this stuff. It's impressive, very impressive, and I go cross-eyed trying to read some of the studies. But thank you very much.
John, with the last word.
It really doesn't matter what I think as the medical director. My wife says that all the time. But it's my ability to convince people in our organization, from the CEO for the cost of these therapies to the actuaries and the CFO, that these therapies have value. So as we said at the outset, give us good, credible evidence about the target patient population, the outcome to expect, and have a strategy in place that mitigates my risk, that shares accountability for the cost of failures, and mitigates the long-term costs associated with for those failures.
Great. Now, I'll just add just a couple of comments to this amazing panel, and I'll just say early discussions with payers is right on the money, but the topics are different than what people think, right? So it's about what are the right trials and populations, how do you set up so we understand the risks that we're going into. I think also be aware of the difference in the time horizons. You know, what you're working with, being an industry, and the payer's time horizon, how long a memory they have and how long a history they have. I think also the nugget that you gave, which is cynical rhymes with clinical. I think that's important. That's actually an important thing, a little mantra to walk home with. And I think the last that I would say in the last 5 seconds is trust. Trust takes a long time to build and only a moment to lose. And I think we could be a trust-based new piece of industry. I think we could be a trust-based health. We can write a new page of trust with these new therapies. And I think you heard from these payers that they want that. And I think in our hearts we want it too. So if that's we walk away with, I think this panel was effective. And I'd like to thank all the members of this panel. It was fantastic to be working with you, and I hope this was useful for you. Thank you. Thank you.